Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Gabrielle Dolan. Gabrielle is a highly sought after keynote speaker, educator, and best-selling author. She is a storytelling expert. She knows that a well-crafted business story can boost a brand strategy and allow leaders to better engage with employees and customers. She has a new book out called Magnetic Stories: Connect with Customers and Engage Employees with Brand Storytelling. I'm excited to have her on the show to talk about storytelling and how that can help us as leaders. So, Gabrielle, welcome.
Thanks, John. What an introduction. It's good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you on the show, and I'm really interested in the subject, especially as an entrepreneur myself and as a leader myself. I'm really excited to have you on the show and listen to what you have to say about storytelling, because I think this is an important subject, and I think our listeners are going to really enjoy it. So let's just start off the bat. So you are a storytelling expert. What is a storytelling expert? And then when did you begin to realize that there's this power in storytelling, especially in business?
You made me laugh then a little bit, John, when you said a storytelling expert, because all my friends that I went to school with think it's quite hilarious that I actually run a business in storytelling, because they would tell you that I was quite the storyteller growing up. So I guess it sort of started from when I'm one of 8 children. So often I say, the only way to get attention was to tell a good story. So right. I think I sort of had this concept of storytelling, but it was in business. So I worked in corporate world. I worked for one of Australia's largest banks, and I, progressed up the ranks to senior leadership roles. And I started to notice that as a leader, when you were trying to communicate your message more effectively, when you were trying to influence an outcome, that when you shared a story, it seemed to get the message across better, and people actually understood it and remembered it. It was in my last couple of roles in that corporate gig that I was actually a change manager. So being change manager on large projects. And that's when I really started to really sort of experiment, I guess, with storytelling. And seriously, when I shared stories, people got the message better. So I looked around. There was a couple of people that had written books. Stephen Denning from America, he was an ex-senior exec at the World Bank, and he'd written a book on storytelling. Annette Simmons had written a book as well. A few others, Laurie Silverman. And there was enough books out there to go, oh, I think there's something in this. I think there's something credible. So because I had been involved in running, designing and delivering leadership programs in my role, I sort of just thought, you know what, I think I could teach people how to communicate more effectively through stories. So that was almost 17 years ago. I started doing that when storytelling wasn't really a thing back then.
Right. No, you're probably the original. So at least bringing that idea into business. And so why do you think stories are so powerful in business, or in powerful in general? What makes stories so unique, and why do we as humans attach ourselves to stories more than just facts and figures?
Yeah, there's a lot of research to say that storytelling is part of our DNA. It's the way we communicate. It's right. But in business, we sort of think it's not professional, and we have this bias towards facts and figures, which, I'm not suggesting for a second we don't need facts and logic and data and everything in business. But the why storytelling is so powerful is it taps into emotion. And when I say emotion, I'm not talking about emotional, because that's sometimes people sort of talk about, oh, we're not doing storytelling, all that emotional fluffy stuff. It's not, but it taps into emotion. And as humans, that's how we make decisions. We are influenced. We are inspired by emotion. Yes, we need the logic, but as humans, we make emotional decisions and we rationalize on logic. And I would suggest that most change fails. So, leaders out there, entrepreneurs out there going, why don't people get this? Why aren't people excited about it? Why aren't people inspired about whether it's their strategy or their mission or values? Is because a lot of the times we're communicating it just on logic and just data and just facts, when we're ignoring, to our own detriment, the power of story.
Yeah, I think you're right. I really do. I think that emotional response, I've had guests on my show talking about failure, and how failure is such an important teacher, because it's an emotional response. Like, I don't want to fail. When I fail, it's emotion, and it puts something in us to want to change. And I think the stories are the same thing. You emotionally connect with the story better than just, well, we need to, we need to increase our sales by 50% this year. Well, okay, that's nice. But you put it in context with the story of where we're headed, where we've come and where we're headed and why we're headed. I think it's more of a connection for people than it is for just 50% increase in sales.
Yeah, which, like that. So what? That's not inspiring. But so, yeah, it really is. And I guess how the subtitle of the book, it's connecting and
Yes.
engaging both your customers and your employees.
Yeah, I love that. So if you look back and just look at the way companies do storytelling or lack thereof, what do companies mostly do wrong in this regard? Just mostly specifically dealing with their outside communication to customers and to potential customers.
Yeah, look, what I've noticed, John, is, and like I said, I started doing this almost 17 years ago, and no one was even really talking about storytelling in business back then. But gradually it's been, rightly recognized as a key way to, communicate both with customers and employees. What I find the common mistake now, because it seems to be really popular, so everyone's talking about, oh, we need to share stories, we need to come up with our brand story or our company story or our strategy story. The biggest mistake I see is people calling something a story, but it's not a story. So they will say, this is our story. And you might have noticed that, John, on the websites, the About Us page has changed to Our Story. And whenever I see something called a story, I'm curious about it. So I get in and look.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, it's not a story. Like a timeline is not a story. So I think one of the biggest mistakes companies make is they're calling something a story, but it's not a story. They'll produce maybe a slick corporate video and go, that's our story. And you look at it and go, it's actually not a story. So that's one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, calling something a story. The other thing I sort of see is or just one story. They just go, no, we're all about brand storytelling, but they'll just have one story. They might have a story of why the company started, for example, which is good. That's one of the stories you need, but you can't communicate your entire brand through one story. You need multiple stories to bring that to life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's great. And we're going to get into what makes a good story here in a little bit. But before we do that, I want to mention that you've got this new book out, Magnetic Stories: Connect with Customers and Engage Employees with Brand Storytelling. So, and we just got breaking news, and I'm excited to hear that you are a finalist, or you're a finalist in the International Book Awards in 3 different categories. So that's pretty exciting. So congratulations on that.
Yes, thanks, John.
What was the catalyst for writing this book? As we talked about earlier, this one has an external focus to us, whereas most of your other books are dealing with leaders and storytelling inside the company and inside with your teams. This one has an external bent to it, like the brand, talking to customers, the industry. So what was the catalyst for this book?
Yeah, look, it's like you said, when I first started doing this 17 years, my focus was all on how leaders share stories internally, how they communicate their values or their strategy to their employees. And that's been the subject of my previous books. What the reason for this book with a bit of an external focus to customers is, again, because I saw storytelling becoming really popular. It was moving from how do we not just do it internally, but externally. And there's a couple of things that I noticed. One I've already talked about. I saw people saying that they were doing storytelling and doing brand storytelling, and I'd look at it and go, but that's not a story, or that's just one story. So it's sort of like, I get a little bit frustrated when I see that, go, that's not a story. The other thing I noticed was I would be speaking to people and they would have this brilliant story, and I would go, please tell me you're sharing that. And they went, oh no, we're not really. And it was like, so there's this concept of companies, leaders, entrepreneurs had all these amazing stories, but they weren't sharing them. And they weren't sharing them either because they didn't understand the power of sharing those stories, or they didn't quite know how to do them, or they think anyone would be interested. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was at an event. I was at a networking event. I was actually the keynote speaker, but I was sitting down speaking to people, and I was speaking to this woman who owns childcare facilities. So she owns a whole handful of childcare facilities. And I was just asking about how she got into it. And she goes, well, I used to be a dentist. And I was like, wow, and she said, yeah. She's told me, I used to be a dentist. Me and my husband were trying to get pregnant for a very long time. And eventually we did. And they had a child. I had a son. And when she was looking for a childcare centre for her son to go back to work, she couldn't find anything that she was happy to leave her son with. She just kept thinking, unless I feel he's going to love it here, I'm not putting it here. She goes, so I decided to buy one and change it to what my son would love. And I heard that story and I just said, please tell me that is front and center on your website. Because if I was looking for a childcare center, I would just read that story and go, sign me up. And she looked at me and went, oh, no, it's not. She goes, because it's not really suitable for an external audience. We talk about it internally. And it was like, oh my God, what such a wasted opportunity, because that story is the most powerful marketing, advertising, communication collateral she has.
Yeah, it defines her brand, right? I mean, that story really defines who they are as a company and why they became who they are, right? I mean, that's the defining story.
It defines their passion, it defines their credibility, and again, people would just be signing up once they read that story.
Right. There's a lot of credibility, and and people will relate to it. Like, oh, yeah, I couldn't find a good place either. Well, this is the right place because I can see, this person felt, they couldn't find the right place, so they created their own. This must be the right place for me too. So I can see it resonating with people looking for that right place for their child. Yeah, that's interesting. So, so that leads into this question, and that is, how do companies increase their brand loyalty through these stories? How do they attract and retain loyal customers through these stories?
Yeah, well, it's sort of like the example I just gave. That is not only going to attract customers, but you're going to keep them. You're going to keep them, and people are going to refer to them. So what a story can do is it's like we talked about. The story has an emotional connection, so we connect to it. We want to be part of this. I'll give you a quick example. It's probably one of my favorite stories in the book. I've got a lot, but this is one of my favorites. When I was growing up, I wasn't really into dolls. I was much more interested in playing football and cricket and riding my skateboard and BMX bike, and I wasn't into dolls. And to be fair to say, I never owned a Barbie. And when over the last, 10, 20 years, where Barbie's been sort of criticized as being poor role models for children and bad body image, I happily bought into that concept. In fact, I've got two daughters that are now 17 and 20, and they never ever got a Barbie. When I was researching for the book, I came across the backstory to Barbie. And the backstory is that Ruth Handler was the wife of one of the co-founders of Mattel that make Barbie. And what she noticed, that when her two children, they had a child, a daughter and a son and a daughter, when they were playing with their respective dolls, both of them pretended they were adults. And while her daughter Barbara could only imagine herself as a caregiver, her son Ken was encouraged to imagine himself as an astronaut or a scientist or a superhero. And by the way, that Ken and Barbie are named after their children. So she pitched this idea of plastic 3D doll with clothes that the little girl could pretend to be something else besides the caregiver. And it was initially not taken on, but she persisted. And in 1959, Barbie debuted at the New York Toy Fair. And there's a quote from Ruth Handler that says, "My whole philosophy with Barbie was that through the doll, the little girl could be anything she wanted to be, that Barbie has always represented that women have choices." Now, when I heard that story, it completely changed my opinion of the brand Barbie. And most importantly, it'll change my future buying habits. So my two daughters never got a Barbie. Maybe any future grandkids might get a Barbie. But then also, I was researching for a book, and I had to research really hard to find that story. And I found snippets of it everywhere. And I thought, what a missed opportunity that
Yeah.
that story is not on every single Barbie package and is not all over their website, because that's another missed opportunity of them not understanding the power of that story.
Well, that's really, really interesting, especially as they came under criticism for body imaging and all that sort of thing. It would have been a great,
Absolutely.
perfect response to say, look, this is what Barbie's all about, you know?
Yeah.
And
So,
actually, if everyone knew the story, they probably wouldn't have come under fire too,
yeah.
as
So,
well. So
John, can I say there's a lot of people that have read my book, and there's so many stories in that book. And I often get emails going, I just wanted to say how great your book is, but can I first say, I've completely changed my opinion of Barbie. That is like, and that's coming from men and women across generations. So it just shows the power of a story. And that's when we talk about brand loyalty, that one story would create brand loyalty.
It would change, your perception. It's almost like the story is your why. You know, why are we here? You know, you talked about the childcare story. It's a clear, why am I here? Why do I have this company? And in the Barbie story, it's a similar thing where it's like, this is why we created Barbie, for this very reason. And it's a missed opportunity when you don't talk about that why why did you create this business, this product, this, whatever you're doing, service, if you will. So it's a missed opportunity when you don't put that out there, because it does, it gives you an emotional connection to that brand versus, oh, it's just a doll, right? It's more than a doll. It's a way, it's a way for children to imagine themselves, especially girls, to imagine themselves they could be anything they want to be. So that's really interesting. Yeah. So you talk about in the book 5 types of stories that every business needs. So what are those 5?
Well, the first one is the creation story, which literally with the 2 examples I've given you are examples of creation. And this is normally why the company started, and which is normally often referred to as the origin story or the founder story. But I actually, because it's also how the product started. So it's not just how the company started, like, the childcare center, but how the product started as a Barbie. So I think the term creation is a better description of that, because it's like you said, it's either how the company started, why the product started, or why the service started. So the why we're doing this. So that's the first one's creation stories. One is culture stories, and there's almost like 2 versions of this. A lot of companies, hey, okay, this is our purpose, this is our mission, but these are our values. And to me, all of that is your culture, especially your values. So culture stories is, what are leaders? So what are leaders in business? How are they sharing personal stories about what those values mean to me? That predominantly, that's a lot of the work I do. So companies will go, oh, we have a value of integrity. But unless leaders are sharing personal stories, and when I say personal stories, I'm just not work-related stories, why integrity is important to them, then people aren't going to get it. So I truly believe if leaders aren't sharing their personal stories around the values, those values just remain words on a wall, and they're not embedded, and people aren't living it, breathing it. So that's a culture story.
Well, it's also, I just want to say one thing on that. I mean, it's interesting. I didn't realize that we were doing it in our company. We're 5 years into business. But one thing I talk about is the rigorous testing and quality we put through our products. We sell products to electric utilities around the country, right? And I always talk when I'm with customers, I say, my father was a lineman, right? So this is personal to me, right? I want to make sure this product is safe and that the people using it can go home to their families every night. So I think it's an example of a cultural story where I'm saying this is the reason why our quality and testing is where it is, because it's personal to me as the founder of the company, as the leader of the company. So I think
that's a classic example where you're talking about, my father was a linesman. I am not putting anything out there that would endanger my father. And that's why it's important to me. So I'm hearing that and I'm going, okay, so it's through that story, that I now truly believe you mean
Right.
that, because a lot of other, your competitors, for example, could just
Right.
be saying, quality is important to us because we don't want to put anyone in danger. It's like,
Right.
yeah, okay, great. But through the story, now you get credibility, and we get an emotional connection to it.
An
So yeah,
emotional connection. Yeah. So I see that right away. Yeah.
yeah, good.
Uh,
Tick, you're doing that. Well done.
One thing right. So, all
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Your third.
Okay. Yeah. So creation stories, culture stories. The other ones are community stories. So what are you doing in your community that's helping? And look, this goes beyond just the corporate responsibility stories.
Yeah.
It could be, what are some of your employees? Your employees might be just volunteering for a company that's got nothing to do with your company or the products and services you say, but you're almost going, hey, we've got really good employees. And it was almost like by default, then you must be a good company to work with. So community stories. The other one is customer stories. So how can you talk about your customers and make them the heroes of the story? So again, this does go beyond customer testimonials, not like, oh, our customer used this and look at them, but how can you make them the hero? I'll give you a quick example, John. It's like I said, I had so much fun writing this book because I got to speak to so many companies around the world doing really cool things with stories. And one of those companies was Columbia Restaurant in Florida, which is the oldest restaurant in Florida. It's a fifth generational.
I've been there and I love it. And everyone needs to go there at some point.
Yes.
So,
okay. So that's, when I said when people give me feedback, it was like, I've changed my opinion of Barbie. And then normally the second thing is, and I really want to go to the Columbia restaurants.
And they need to,
so
yes.
You do. So yeah, okay, great. You love it. You've been there. I haven't, but which I did go when I was in Florida quite a few years ago. But I'll give you an example of a great customer story. So on Valentine's Day last year, they shared a story on their Facebook page, social medias, about a couple that had celebrated their wedding anniversary at the Columbia restaurant for 72 years in a row.
I think I remember seeing that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they talk about, they came to the restaurant on their first wedding anniversary, and the second anniversary, they came back and coincidentally just got the same table. And so for the next 70 years, Columbia Restaurant have reserved that same table for them, and they've come back. So it's like through, and they go celebrating lovebirds around the world and on Valentine's Day. But it's through that story, it's all about their customers. But by default, you're going, that's a pretty amazing thing that the restaurant's done that. And it must be a pretty special restaurant if this couple has chosen to it. So it's you got to be mindful that you're just not talking about yourself, but you're talking about your customers that by default paints you in a very good light as well.
Yeah. So, I love that story because they're the hero, the customer is the hero in the story. They're setting the example, but also it ties to the fact that this restaurant's special. This restaurant's been here 4 years, 70, whatever it was, 71 years, but it has that long legacy and it's a special place and it's always been a special place. So, you can see all that connects really well. And it's definitely an emotional story too, that you just connect with. You're like, well, where am I going to take my wife on date night? Well, let's go where they went for 74 years. Yeah. That's great.
And the final story, and you're going to notice that they all start with C, because I do like, a nice consistent palette, is a challenge story. So sometimes what challenges has the company faced and how you've overcome them. Now, these can just be really small, or they could be larger ones. And sometimes, I think often how a company responds to a challenge probably brings in their values and those culture stories. So I'll give another quick example too, because this came during the lockdown in March last year. So when all of us went into lockdown, there was a gin distillery based out of Sydney in Australia, and it was it was only like about 5 years old, this company, so really quite young. They had a bar attached to their gin distillery. And when we went into lockdown, they were really concerned that their 15 employees in the bar were going to lose their job. So they instantly decided to swap from making gin to making hand sanitizer because there was a big shortage. And when I say instantly, within 3 days, they had produced 7,500 bottles of hand sanitizer. So
That's
they, you know,
great.
they
Yeah.
had sourced bottles, they had ticked
Yep.
off all the health requirements, they designed and printed labels, and they had produced 7,500 bottles. Over the next several months, they went on to produce over 100,000 bottles of hand sanitizer,
Wow.
not only securing the jobs for their 15 staff, but they were actually able to employ another 15 local people in the hospitality industry that had lost their jobs. So
That's
you
great.
look at that story and you go, yes, it's a challenge story, but it's an absolute culture story, because they
Mhm.
were, I think, one of their values, two of their values was innovation and quality, and they just went bang, they went in to do
Mm.
it. It also shows perhaps a community story. It doesn't really matter what type of story it is, but it's you know, just finding these different types of stories. I actually spoke to the head of marketing to interview her for the book. And she said that that story, once they put it out there, it got global recognition. Like, they were
Mm.
interviewed around the world on this story. She said it doubled their database. Their database, over a few months, their database doubled. And as a young brand, she predicted that the brand awareness of their brand increased by about 18 months where they would have expected to be. And their social media traffic increased 35% or something. So based on that one story, I mean, clearly it was based on the action. So they've done the
Right. Right.
action, but they proactively shared the story, and the story has resonated, which means people then want to keep sharing it.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows the character of the company, how they overcame adversity, and how they, they stuck to their values in the
Mm.
midst of all this, challenge that everybody went through in business. So, yeah, that's a great story. We had a local entrepreneur here in Raleigh that made his company is in they make insect repellent, but it's all natural insect repellent, and they did the same thing. They shifted production over to hand sanitizers, and he ended up winning a contract he was a Navy veteran like myself, and won the contract for the U.S. Navy, supplied all of the hand sanitaries to the U.S. Navy, and kept all his people engaged and employed. So, yeah. And I got a chance to have him on the podcast to talk about
Oh,
that. So, but it
cool.
was that's why the story resonates with me, is I've actually met somebody that had done something very similar, not a gin company, but a bug repellent company that
Mm, mm,
shifted over into hand sanitizers in the
yeah.
beginning of the pandemic. So
Mm.
that's
And
fantastic.
in both those incidents, John, if those companies continue to make them, now they may
Right.
not, but if they continue to make them, that becomes the creation story of the product. And
It
so
does.
again, it
Yeah.
shouldn't be lost, because you don't want to be looking at an insect repellent company and going, why are you making hand sanitizers? Or a
Right.
gin
Right.
company making big, and you go, because this is the backstory of the product. And
It's
you
the
go, well, and so
backstory.
it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I like that a lot. So I was just thinking about it just in terms of practical. I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business. Uh, where would these stories reside? I mean, obviously they can be in websites, they can be in brochures, they can be in the presentations you make to customers. So where do these stories, where do you see them residing? What are good companies? Where do they reside in these great companies you talk about?
Yeah, and look, of course, all of those, all the standard things, it should be on websites. If you're doing a
Yeah.
presentation, you should be talking about it. If you've got a newsletter, talk about it. So all those, I guess, traditional
Hmm.
ways you'd communicate, but you can get really creative and think of other stuff. So I think the really good companies, and especially the really good companies, have stories throughout their induction program. So
Hmm.
if you've got an induction program at all, it should be just story based. So again, some companies I spoke about in the book that's what they're doing, because when you think about it, what an induction program is about, it's not just, where the toilets are and the
Right. Right.
OH&S stuff. It's about the values. What's
Yeah.
accepted behavior here? What do we do? If you're sort of saying, oh, we're about exceptional customer service, well, give me lots of examples of
Yeah.
employees delivering exceptional customer service. So I go, oh, okay, that's what it's about. So induction programs need to be story-based. And if they're not story-based, I doubt whether they're effective. Just the leaders sharing them. So how can you, so it's just the verbal sharing. So, leaders sharing them internally, potential customers, how they're sharing those stories. but you can get really creative. I've seen some companies put little mini stories on beer coasters or
Oh
coffee
yeah.
cups,
Yeah.
stuff, stuff in their foyer. Like if you got a big foyer, one of the companies I spoke to was Fullerton Hotels and Resorts, based in Sydney and Singapore, and their main iconic buildings in Singapore. And they've just collected all these amazing stories of the people that used to work in this building, because it used to be
Mm,
like the post
I like
office, and
that.
it's this
Yeah. Yeah.
massive, the most iconic building in Sydney. And they've got, okay, well, we've got all these artifacts, but how do we find the
Mm,
stories behind them? So just using stories all the time. Even we've spoken about the Columbia restaurants. What they do is, I mean, they've got stories around the chandelier that's in the thing, the
yes.
fountain, a
Yes.
window. They will have stories around, like a table, like they'll know the stories around the table, and all their employees need to hear these stories, because then the employees share it with customers. And what they talk about is, it moves it from just eat a meal to an experience, to a dining
Mm,
experience. So it's thinking of all the different places you can share these stories.
I love it. I love it. I know as a smallest company in my space, right? I compete against billion-dollar companies, and we're 5 years in. Is that my competitors don't really have the stories. They're big corporations, global corporations, and they don't necessarily have those stories. And I find that customers connect with us because they recognize our origin story and why we started and what we're trying to do differently. So I definitely see, like when we go to trade shows, people are attracted to us because you know, we're the guys that say, no more. We're not, I think what's happening in this industry is wrong. We're doing things differently. And they're
Mm.
attracted to kind of our rebellious nature, and that we're kind of rebelling against like these big corporate companies that have, treat everybody like a number and have these long lead times. And so I think I don't I didn't realize we were doing it, but I think people are resonating with our, rebel story where we're kind of pushing up against the big companies. And I think people like that and they want to be part of that story. They want to be, kind of rebelling against the status quo, if you will, in the industry. So I think that's kind of interesting. And
Yeah.
I think we probably need to talk about it more. I know I talk to it a lot one-on-one with customers and why we started, but I think we could be doing more on our web page and, on our product literature, that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just finally getting around to reading Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game, and he talks
Yes.
about a just cause, and
Mm,
it's got to be like bigger. It's got to stand for something, and it's got to be service orientated, and it's got to be resilient. And almost what I'm hearing from you, that your just cause is challenging the status quo.
it
So
is.
it's not, and that's the infinite game, which
Yeah.
is kind of continually challenge the status quo,
Well,
which means you're going to attract employees that want to be part of that just cause. But the other cool thing is you're going to attract clients that want to be part of that just cause.
yeah, I think you're right. And it's actually we actually, if you go to says who we are, it actually says we challenge the status quo. So I think at
Mm.
least we got that right on our webpage, but we probably have to do a little bit more work on that. So
Yeah. And I reckon, John, you'd easily find, if I sort of said to you, why is that important? Why is that important? You would end up telling me a story from your
yeah,
childhood or growing up. It could be, my parents always did it, or they always told me
right.
to do, or I was always encouraged. And you'll find a story from your childhood that goes, wow, this challenging the status quo was part of me. That's always been in
Yeah,
me.
yeah, I love
And
it.
then that becomes one of your culture stories, because one of your values ultimately is challenging the status quo.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. I think we need to work on that some more. So so I have a question for you. So you are the, I don't know, creator, the owner of Jargon Free Fridays. What are Jargon Free Fridays, and what don't you like about business jargon? So I
Well,
like this, by the way.
yeah, it's funny. I talked about Simon Sinek's Just Cause, and it's sort of, and he actually suggested you should write it down. And I was thinking, if I wrote my Just Cause down, what would it be? And it is about, we in business, we need to communicate in a way that's more human, that's more real and
Okay.
authentic. And to
Yeah.
me, stories is that. So the way you do that is sharing these personal stories, as opposed to the complete opposite of that, is the jargon and acronyms we use. So
Mm,
jargon and acronyms is the default business language, which mean
yes.
say nothing, where stories is what really connects and humanizes with people. So Jargon Free Fridays came about as a little bit of, to me, it's a fun way to raise awareness to what I think is a pretty serious problem. And,
Yes.
and the concept is it's really hard to give up jargon. So it's really hard to not use it because sometimes we don't even know we're using it. It's really hard to do it. But if you're aware of it, let's just try to do it one day on a Friday. So that was the whole idea of Jargon Free Fridays, because, and, you know, when I do my training and when I do my keynotes, I bring this up and I bring it up in a fun way, and everyone sits there and goes, they'd laugh, but go, it's that nervous laugh where it's like, oh my God, we do that. That's what we say. And, you know, because for every acronym, there's multiple variations. Like if I say SME to you, it could be subject matter expert or could be small to medium enterprise. And we could be having a conversation about SMEs, but both of us are thinking something different. So yeah, we use acronyms because we think it's efficient, but it's actually, it's quite lazy, and it's actually putting all the onus on the other person to interpret it. And then you're hoping they interpret it correctly. Okay. So I walked past, I was walking down our street the other day, and this sign has probably been there for a while, but I hadn't noticed for it before. So someone's got a proper sign made up, gone to the effort to make a proper sign, and it says, this building contains ACM. And I'm going, great. I wonder what ACM means. And I was thinking, mate, the fact that they've gone to this to make a sign, it must be quite serious. And I think maybe it's got something to do with asbestos. So I looked it up. First of all, there was about 200 definitions of ACM, but one of them is asbestos containing material. Oh, and I was like, wouldn't it just be better to say this building contains asbestos? Like, asbestos can kill you. So why don't we make it clear in the sign? But this building contains ACM is ridiculous. Yeah. Oh yeah. That makes a lot of sense. You know, it's funny. We used to have a boss that was, he was big on jargons, and we used to play a game called buzzword bingo. Oh yeah. We would track down how many times he would say certain words that he was known to say. And it was quite a sport. We had a lot of fun with it, but I think you can get carried away with it. And I think too, it doesn't, I think when leaders are using a lot of jargon, or you know, buzzwords, it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel real. It feels fake and forced, you know? Yeah. And people don't connect with it. I remember, this is probably going back about 25 years ago when I did work still in my corporate gig. I was working with this manager, and he always used to say executional excellence. Like he talked about executional excellence. And one day I just said, can I just say, Jeff, I'm not sure I know what that means, and I'm not sure anyone else knows what it means. Yeah. I would often joke at executional excellence just sounds like you've killed someone, but you've done it really well. Really well. And he explained it to me in more jargon, like, you know, it's about best practice, blah, blah, blah. And I said, what if you just had to use it in normal words? How would you say it? And he was almost getting frustrated with me for asking. Right. And he said, well, it's put simply, it's once we decide to do something, let's make sure we do it right. And I was like, why don't you say that? Because I think everyone would engage and connect with that. And you know what? I'm sure he's got a story around why that was important to him. Right, I bet you if I dug deeper, he would go, you know, my mum always used to say to me, if you're going to do something, make sure you do it right. And it was so almost, it's like now, this is something I can connect with and engage with and go, well, clearly let's do that, as opposed to executional excellence, which means nothing. It means nothing. Yeah. It means nothing. It feels forced and it doesn't feel natural. Yeah. Yeah. It's not the way humans talk to each other. No. And that's the other concept of Jargon Free Friday. If we seriously spoke the way we did in business, in any other aspect of our life, we would call it out for how ridiculous it is. So on the website, I've got little videos like, you know, if we explained about sex to our kids with jargon, or if a marriage proposal was in jargon, it sounds ridiculous when we use it outside of business. Yeah, it really does. So, and you got to be careful as a leader that you're not using
if you catch yourself using a lot of buzzwords, it's time to like slow down. Like, why am I
It
saying
is.
these
It
words?
is.
Because sometimes we're
Yeah,
parroting others, right? It's not like
exactly.
I did 22 years in corporate America myself. And so you get to where there's language in the business that, you speak in that business, right? To fit in, right? If you
Yeah.
will, but
Yeah. And that's another reason we
yeah,
use jargon, because it's a way of acceptance. It's a way of fitting
right,
in, because everyone else is saying move the needle or ducks in a row or run it up a
right, right.
flagpole. And we're just repeating these things. Let's run it up a
Yeah.
flagpole. Okay. What does that mean?
Right. And I do notice, because I've had 9 different manufacturing plants that I've run in my career. And I've noticed that these things work, maybe they work in certain circles. When you're talking about the hourly employee on the shop floor, you can't talk that way, because
No.
they don't know what you're talking about, and they feel like it's fake. And so
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
you got to be really careful who your audience is if you're using words like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's, if you're in an industry or area and talking to the same people that understand it and know it, then okay. But the vast majority of the time, we're speaking to people outside of our industry. And when we start using internal language to our customers, we're actually disconnecting and isolating people.
Yeah.
So why would we do that?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. That's great. All right. Well, how can people find out more about your company and all of your books?
Well, if you're interested in jargon, you can go to jargonfreefridays.com and have a little bit of a laugh. You can do that.
Okay.
But the best place if you're interested in storytelling and my work and my books, it's gabrielledolan.com. So, and I have a storytelling starter kit. So it's free. And what it is you'll get an email from me once a day for 7 days to just if you're thinking about how do I get started on this, then that could be a place to go. And you can access my books there, but you can access the books from all the usual suspects, Amazon. It's in paper copy, it's in Kindle, or, ebook and audio.
Okay. That's great. Well, so I'm encouraging all of our listeners to take a look at this, called Magnetic Stories: Connect with Customers and Engage Employees with Brand Storytelling. And Gabrielle, there's a copy of it. Those on YouTube are seeing it. Gabrielle, this has been really, really good, and I really appreciate you being on the show. I think you've introduced some concepts to us that we really need to think about in terms of how are we connecting our business to our customers, how are we connecting our business to our employees in a way that's a story that connects us emotionally to our customers and our employees. I think this is really good, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all of your insight.
Thanks, John. I really appreciated it. And yeah, maybe to wrap it all up, I can say acronyms: enrage, stories engage. So less acronym, more stories.
More stories. I
Yeah.
love it. That's great. Well, that's something that we all need to take away from this. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks, John.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.